Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. As you all can see, I have with me Lieutenant General Dr. R.S. Panwar. General Panwar has taken us through two videos till now, very interesting videos, and I request you all to kind of, watch them because they talk about a totally different aspect of warfare. The first one that we spoke about was of information warfare. Some examples of the information warfare we ourselves went through within India, and we see the same spanning out within the conflict between Russia and Ukraine as well. The second one that we had done was in artificial intelligence and the military application of it. To be honest, that was an eye-opener to me because it talked about an aspect of military warfare that is not really discussed in the open forum quite a lot. Today, I have General Panwar here to talk to us about cyber sovereignty and a capability which India would require to protect as well as create an offensive capability in the world of cyber warfare. Sir, thank you so much for joining us today. And, the biggest thing that I take from our discussion till now is the dependence on systems of the militaries for their defensive and offensive capabilities. Militaries and, of course, countries is growing day by day, and we see examples of them happening around us all through the time. The line is very murky. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Aadi. It's always a pleasure being on your show, and Jahan to all your viewers. As you said, the subject which you have picked up today is actually a hot topic of discussion across the globe. In the Indian context, it has not really seen that much of exposure. So I'm really excited to have this interaction with you today.
Absolutely, sir. This is a thing that we spoke about during information warfare discussion as well. The line regarding war in these kind of operations is very blurred. And that brings me to my first question. We see a huge amount of, conflict within the cyberspace between state-sponsored actors, and they are basically targeting the national infrastructure of their opponent countries. The biggest question, as I said, is that what is the red line in this entire thing? I mean, is there a line wherein a state crosses which can be declared as a act of war? Is there any sort of a work within the international law or any such forum which is being brought about talking about a structure of cyber warfare, sir?
I think that's a very interesting, though complex question. I think there'll have to be a slightly longish answer. So let me straight away dive into the topic. As you correctly referred to, that there is a gray zone war going on at the moment. And since you talked about international law, we're obviously talking of wars between states. So, as we discussed in our first interaction, as far as gray zone warfare is concerned, it's the operational space between peace and war. And as a nation, when you fight, whole of nation approach, there are basically four aspects to it: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. There are some other aspects which you can think of. So we discussed that day information operations as part of this whole of nation approach. We also talked about a five-dimensional battle space: land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. In the military context, there's a five-dimensional battle space which is talked about. And cyberspace, really speaking, correctly speaking, infospace is the domain of warfare which we are talking of today, and cyber operations is one of the components. So now, when we talk of international law and red lines as far as cyber warfare is concerned, this is a debate which has been going on for the last almost 20 years now at the UN, etc. Now, if we have to understand what is at stake here, I think you also mentioned sovereignty as being one of the key issues. So yes, the entire international law, as far as the physical spaces are concerned, that is land, sea, air, when we talk of that, is linked to the idea of sovereignty. So when sovereignty is violated, that's the time you get into a state of war, and their international law comes into place when two states are in conflict with each other. So what is this sovereignty? Let's see in the physical sense first. What do we mean by sovereignty? So in the physical sense, physical spaces, sovereignty is pretty clearly defined. So as far as land is concerned, the international borders between nations, that if you transgress that, that's a transgression of sovereignty. I mean, it's linked to the idea of territorial integrity. That is one aspect of it. I'll come to another aspect of sovereignty just now, but let's look at the territorial integrity first. So land borders, that's very clear. As far as sea air is concerned, it is the air above the land borders up to a certain height. Now that height is not very clear where the airspace finishes and space begins. But what is this vertical space where the boundaries are, that portion is very clear. As far as sea is concerned, there are territorial waters which have been defined, I think 20 nautical miles from the land borders. So the idea of territorial boundaries and physical spaces is very well defined. How do you define boundaries in cyberspace? Now that's the question. So we'll come to that, how to go about defining this. But what I wanted to bring out is that this debate which has been going on in the international fora, let's see what has been going on at the UN first. Now, at the UN, the group of government experts. That's a normal way of UN to go about discussing affairs. So there's 6 DGs which have been held so far, and what has been decided, or let's say agreed upon, consensus has been arrived upon in those DGs after years of discussion, is that international law, just like it applies in physical space, it applies in cyberspace as well. Now that portion has been agreed upon. There also a parallel approach which has been started at the UN, that is the open-ended working group. Now this open-ended working group, how is it different from the DGs? Both are UN processes. The DG is a small group of nations, major nations, but small group of nations. So actually in 2013 and 2015, the 2 DGs which were there came up with a set of agreeable norms. That's when the real breakthrough was made, when they agreed that international law applies in cyberspace. Now what happened is that there was an initiative to have larger number of nations involved, not just 15, 20. And so this idea of open-ended working group came up. And in this, almost all the countries which are associated with the UN, I think almost 175 or maybe 190, they are part of this open-ended working group. And they also have accepted the fact that international law applies in cyberspace. Now that portion is agreed to. But how will it be applied? That's where the big question mark lies. Where are these red lines, as you put it? How do we go about defining these red lines? So I'll talk a little bit on this aspect as to where is this conundrum. So I talked about the traditional boundaries. Now let's look at cyberspace. Cyberspace, how you can't really. So one approach which has been adopted is that if there are physical effects which are felt in another nation, then let's say state A creates physical effects in state B through cyberspace. So for example, a simple thing, it puts in a worm and it slows down computers in the state B. So there's a physical effect which has been felt. Now that is one thing which is one approach which is there, that if there is a physical effect, sovereignty has been violated. So that's one way to look at it. There could be major physical effects. So for example, if somebody interferes with the nuclear plants of an adversary nation, and let us say that goes for a 6 and large population is affected by it, that's a major effect, catastrophic effect, as you can say. But there could be a very simple effect also. Like I said, a computer could be slowing down. Now, these are all effects. It has nothing to do with where is the boundary per se, as we understand boundary in the normal terms. So this is one approach, an effects-based approach, which has been mooted. But there is no consensus as of now. These are just discussions going on. The second way to look at it is that cyberspace is actually cyber is what it's flow of information. It's basically information. It's a nebulous thing, intangible, nebulous sort of a thing. But it moves. It is created on physical infrastructure. So that physical infrastructure in terms of your optic fiber cables and routers and things like that. So all that physical infrastructure which is there, uh, that a country has got sovereign rights over that infrastructure. And this is linked to the ethics-based approach, which I just told you, that if that physical infrastructure, cyber infrastructure, gets affected in some manner, sovereignty would have been violated. So that's the way to look at how sovereignty would be violated. Now we've just come to the second step. Violation of, firstly, is that international law applies in cyberspace, and the second thing is how cyber sovereignty can be violated. But what if it is violated? I mean, just because sovereignty is violated does international law kick in? So before I answer that, let me bring out another aspect of sovereignty. It is just not integrity or territorial integrity, or in the case of cyber, I just explained to you, it is also if you interfere with the functioning of a government, any governance function of a sovereign state, if you happen to interfere in that, that also amounts to violation of sovereignty. As an example, if the electoral process, as was done, for example, in the US 2016 elections, the electoral processes, as also in the French elections, if the electoral process is interfered with through cyberspace, that also would amount to violation of sovereignty. So it's not just in cyberspace, even otherwise, if you, through coercion, etc., in some way, interfere with the governance function of an opposing state or adversary state, you're transgressing sovereignty. And so also in cyberspace, I just give an example how through cyberspace you can affect sovereignty. So these are two different aspects of how you can violate sovereignty. But the story doesn't end there. The final part is, just because if sovereignty is violated, does international law come into the picture? When we say international law, it means that is it justified for a counter action to take place, either by the state or by the UN? Is that justified? So here there are three different thresholds. The answer is a little long, but this is the last part of it. So these three, if you understand these three thresholds, we would have understood the basics of how international law applies in physical as well as cyberspace. What are these three thresholds? The three thresholds are, first threshold is the threshold of use of force, as it is called, which means that if state A, I'll talk of physical examples first, if state A physically interferes with, or let us say, uses armed force. If you were talking of Ukraine a little while back, you had a interaction yesterday itself, it was released on Ukraine. So if an armed attack takes place in an adversary state, that is what is called as the threshold of armed conflict, or the threshold of the use of force. So that justifies the defending state to react to it, or even the UN to react. That is that's the highest threshold which we can call it. But there's a threshold below that. So, for example, if one interferes with the functioning of a state, as I gave the example of this electoral process. Now, this is an example of being below the threshold of the use of force. This also, it is called the principle of intervention as far as international law is concerned, principle of intervention. So principle of intervention, without going into details, it is all actions which interferes with the sovereign powers or the sovereign functioning of a state without going into the use of force. That is called the principle of intervention, and international law permits countermeasures to be taken. Now, those countermeasures cannot be the use of force, but there are certain countermeasures which otherwise would have been illegal by the victim state to take. But if the principle of intervention is violated, then such countermeasures can be taken. So, why all this is important, this second level, why is it important in connection with cyber activity? Is that equating cyber to the use of force is a very high threshold, which normally is not likely to happen. Most of the cyber attacks which are taking place are happening below the threshold of the use of force. But there are many which can classify as interfering, as transgressing or violating the principle of intervention. So that's the second threshold. There is a third threshold also, which is under debate as of now. Not everybody agrees to it. And that is that if sovereignty itself is just violated and it doesn't amount to violation of the principle of intervention, that means it doesn't cross that threshold, the red lines that you were talking about, and obviously doesn't cross the highest threshold of the use of force, can it justify a countermeasure to be taken by the victim state? Now, that's the one rule which is called sovereignty as a rule, which is under great debate today as of now. So, suppose, for example, you push in a cyber attack and it just, like I said, slows down a computer, or let us say it just crashes a computer, so to say. Both of them are not really affecting, they don't really amount to transgressing even the principle of intervention, unless the critical infrastructure of a state is brought down. It doesn't amount to it. So suppose just a criminal action takes place. Does it warrant or does it legally justify an action by the victim state? So this is the question which is under debate. Should sovereignty be taken as a rule? That means if you violate it, countermeasures are warranted. So this is the lowest level of threshold. So this level, sovereignty as a rule threshold level, and sovereignty as a principle of intervention transgraded at that level, these are the two which are most important when we look at cyber attacks in cyberspace, and how does a nation react to it. So in short, I've told you how international law is linked to cyberspace and how the whole thing is linked to physical conflicts between states.
Thank you for that, sir. You've given a very good structure for this discussion to happen, because at the end of it, as you also mentioned, and I also mentioned in the question, the lines are very murky. And today we see large rogue nations kind of literally mushing away this particular line. Although a structure which is being created to regularize this entire thing would be welcome, but you know, implementing its decisions is another big question that we will have to debate upon. One of the things that I'd like to talk to you right now is about a cyber defense strategy, sir. Within the defense strategy, one would always look at a factor that we just put up a firewall, we protect our systems better, we make sure that they are hack proof, and so on and so forth, protecting them from viruses and worms and a whole lot of other issues that can be done. My question would come in this aspect is that whether by creating an offensive strategy, does that also come under the purview of a defense strategy, because that will also create a certain amount of deterrence for the opposing nation to think about doing something like this onto another one?
That's a great question, Aadi. In fact, in general, people think of cyber defense. The moment we start talking of cyber defense, as you said, we start thinking of firewalls and all protective measures. Password should be right, and firewall should be put up, and so on and so forth. Well, there's a lot which is there if in talks of cyber defense strategies per se. Now, there are two basic strategies which one can classify in cyber defense. One is defense by denial, and the other is defense by retaliation or defense by punishment. Now, these are two broad categories of strategies which one can talk of. Now, when we say defense by denial, what do you mean? What it in simple terms implies is that if your defenses are very strong, There's several layers which have to be crossed, etc. So the attacker will think it is not worthwhile to, attack the system, and so you're denying. That is one aspect of defense by denial. So you're deterring him. I actually slightly misspoke. It is deterrence by denial and deterrence by retaliation. Two types of deterrence in cyber defense strategies, which we can talk about, right? So if the defenses are too strong, the attacker is deterred from attacking because it is not worth it. That is one way. The other is that, okay, once attacked, there were some vulnerabilities which were identified, and the attacker managed to attack, but the victim, whichever is the victim, whether it's individual or an organization or a state, is resilient enough to quickly come back up on road. So it might go down for a little while, but its resilience architecture is so good that it comes back, and so ultimately the effect is very minimal. So this resilience is the second aspect of deterrence by denial. So one is protection, one is resilience, two aspects to it. Now let's talk about the other most important aspect of deterrence by retaliation. Now this is where it all gets linked up with international law applying in cyberspace. Because when you say retaliate, now that retaliation, firstly, the retaliation could be in cyberspace, or the retaliation could even be, if it is permitted by international law that you can react as far as legally is concerned, then that retaliation could be other means. But today we will restrict ourselves to retaliating in cyberspace. So I'll throw some light as to what are these different types of levels of, what is this offensive angle? This whole thing is referred to in the general sense of offensive defense. So let me just elaborate a little bit on this aspect. How do we distinguish between defensive cyber action and offensive cyber action? Now there's literature still developing. The way I look at it is as follows. That if you are taking any measure which is in your own networks, it is restricted to actions in your own networks, that I would refer to as defensive cyber. And for any measure which you have to go across from your own country's networks and go into other states, it may be adversary state, it may be third states. For anything that you have to go across beyond your boundaries, that is the physical infrastructure boundaries, which I referred to earlier, that would classify as offensive cyber operations, any action. Now, if this is the way we define offensive cyber actions, there again, there are several different types of cyber operations that we can talk about. So let's start from the most benign, the lowest level. This is cyber intelligence, acquiring of cyber intelligence. Now, cyber intelligence, just like normal methods of what general people we are aware of, human intelligence is one way we acquire intelligence, that is through spies, etc. Then you have electronic intelligence. You intercept radio waves and you acquire electronic intelligence. So if you compare with electronic intelligence, that's very passive in the sense that you don't have to go across, transgress the sovereignty of a nation to acquire intelligence, because you're just capturing a wave which is coming to you wherever you are, right? Of course, some cases you may have to go across into the physical territory, but you can always intercept waves which are coming into your country. So acquiring of intelligence through cyber means you put in an exploit as a virus, worm, whatever that malicious soft code is there. It goes, it acquires intelligence, extracts it, and gives it back to you. Now that is the lowest level. Why is it the lowest level? Because really speaking, you're not disrupting anything. And you have designed it so that it is not even detected. It may even obliterate its footprint once the intelligence has been acquired. So the whole design is to do it in a covert manner without detection, and you're not disrupting anything. That's the main thing why it is at the first level. Now let's go one level higher. This second level can be, it's talked of as, the US today is talking of it as hunt forward or defend forward. There is also a third term being used, persistent engagement. In fact, persistent engagement was used a couple of years back, and now the US is zeroed on, they're using two terminologies, hunt forward and defend forward. Now, what does that mean? Let's take the example of organized crime. It could apply for a state level activity also. It could be applied to a state sponsored activity also. But for the time being, let's say there's an organized crime syndicate, and organized crime, cyber crime I'm talking about, and they are trying to attack your assets within your country. And in general, the way we are talking about here is anything that has strategic effects. It affects national security in some manner. So if some individual ransomware is their individual computer, some organization, that really is not that much of a consequence. But if it is an organized crime, that's why I use the word organized, it has having major effects. And so how does one counter that? One way of going about it, one step one can take is go across, again through your own exploits, try to see, firstly, gather intelligence of how these cyber criminals are carrying out their activity, which means that there are various servers. It may be attacking via a third or a fourth country through a chain to make their own attacks anonymous. Attribution is a big issue in cyberspace, as we all know. So to try and find out how they are functioning, that is one step. And the other is disrupt their networks. So this is the second angle. So in the first angle, still you're only trying to find out. But the second aspect of this defend forward is you disrupt their networks through which they launch their attacks. So this is, I would say, the second two parts of the second level. In one case, you're going across, you're finding out information, you're hunting forward and trying to find out. And in the second part of it, you're also disrupting it. So this, though not very clearly and openly and formally defined by anybody so far, but this is what is generally meant by this aspect of defend forward, hunt forward. Then let's come to the next level of defense, the third level. That is when you're actually designed to disrupt the adversary, whoever this adversary is. When I say adversary, it may not be a state, it may be organized crime adversary, it may be non-state actors, or it may be a state actor, all types of actors. So now you feel that, let us say, now I'm going to take a scenario of a Ukraine type of a scenario where a conflict is imminent. Yeah, they're saying within the next 2-3 days, attack might come in. So a conflict is imminent. Now, in such a case, a preemptive cyber attack can be launched. So a preemptive attack is one aspect of it. A retaliatory attack is another aspect of it. Now, both preemptive and, let's say, Ukraine takes such actions today. So Ukraine is at the receiving end. It's a victim state in the current scenario. So it takes a preemptive attack. Or let us say even the other nations who are standing behind Ukraine, they carry out preemptive attacks. So since we were talking about defensive strategies, a preemptive attack would very well fall within defensive strategies. You would agree with me?
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, a retaliatory attack. So once an attack has actually occurred, if you react to it, that's again defense because you're defending yourself, right? So these are again two different 2A, 3A and 3B, level 3A and 3B, preemptive attack, where you're actually carrying out physical attack to disrupt. So I'll again recapitulate. At the lowest level was where you're gathering intelligence, no disruptions. At the second level, you were trying to find out various things and trying to disrupt that aspect of it, the activity before they could launch an attack. In the third level, you're actually attacking their systems. It is not that you're disrupting their networks, which you're supposed to be attacking us, but you're actually attacking their systems as a preemptive attack. as a precursor for a physical attack which is going to take place. So these two, preemptive and retaliatory, are both in the context of actual offensive operations. Now, as a um, as a twist, let's say a different perspective of the whole thing, that this third level which I talked about, where you're disrupting, if you had done this as an offensive, so for example, the same disruptive attack Russia does on Ukraine today. Okay, so it's the initiator of the offensive. So if it does against Ukraine today, that would classify as an offensive cyber attack. So now we would have, at that is a time when you would have, one can't really classify this type of a thing as a defensive attack. But really speaking, the expertise which is required in all four of these, all four levels which I'm saying, in all four of them, you're going beyond your networks, you're using malicious code. It's just the connotations of effect which is taking place and the intention and the scenario in which these actions are taking place, that all these four levels of offensive cyber operations, as we defined. Offensive, going beyond your networks, but there are four different ways you can look at it. So, why I've gone into these details is that any nation, and India, of course, is really affected. You know, the types of cyber attacks which are exponentially increasing on a daily basis, and so also all the major nations. So the sum of the whole what I've just stated is to bring out the importance of developing offensive cyber capability with a nation if we want to make ourselves capability. This part of capability development, if we just like we prepare ourselves capability development in the physical spaces, we have our armored divisions and artillery and so on and so forth. All that does not make us into an offensive sort of a nation. It is all part of the defense of the nation. So all these capabilities we need to have in good measure to be able to defend our national cyberspace. So that is what I was trying to get at.
That's a lot for a country to even fathom, because at the end of it, one of the things that we realize is that the kind of offensive power that is being brought across by a lot of aggressive nations, if I may put it that way, is a developing order. It's not something which is constant, and it's getting creative day by day. There are countries like Russia and China which are famous for this entire thing. So, since I mentioned China, I'd like to actually ask you, one of the biggest problems that we see in our system in India is that we are a democracy, we are an open society, we've got our problems, and those problems are actually discussed on a wide open paradigm, like, for example, Twitter. Twitter actually, um, it gives us an idea of how a social trend can actually go viral, and how things can actually uh, affect a national outlook, for that matter. We see this whole hijab problem right now, and I'm not wanting to give a judgment in that, but because of the online platform, you can see this entire thing actually spreading across the world, because we are a free and open country. One of the things that I want to ask you, sir, it becomes more and more difficult for anybody to sit in a country like India to defend against these kind of trends which are coming across. It may have originated in India, but the propagation of this particular trend might happen anywhere around the world. I'm not saying for this particular purpose, but for any cyber trend or anything like that comes in. This is a complete asymmetry, because we cannot be doing the same in China, and there is going to be a huge gap that will pretty much never be able to be filled up. How do we handle this entire thing?
That's again a great question, and it takes us into a different realm altogether as far as cyberspace is concerned. If you remember, we had discussed when we were discussing information operations in the first video. One of the aspects in relation to cyberspace I referred to there is cyber influence operations. So, social media, cyber influence operations, it is that realm which we are going. But there's much more than what we discussed then. I'll try to, throw some light on this aspect of it. And as you correctly pointed out, that it is autocracies vis-a-vis democracies. Liberal democratic nations appear to be on the back foot for certain reasons. And autocratic nations have got an upper hand in this sort of a space, in this sort of a conflict. So, how is it? What is it about autocratic nations that give them an advantage over liberal democracies? And so, let's try and understand this aspect. There's again, there are several facets to it. But the basic issue here, when we talk of liberal democracies, one of the prime issues here is that in liberal democracies, the cyberspace, and when we say cyberspace, let's understand it as the internet. That's some in substance of what is understood generally as cyberspace, although that is not really the full cyberspace that we should be talking about. But let's talk of the internet. So the internet, as it was conceptualized initially and the way it has been built up, is viewed by the liberal democracies as a global commons. Now, what is the meaning of global commons? For those of your viewers who may not answer, for example, international seas or space, which is not part of the territory of any nation. That is what is referred to as global commons. That is free to use by others. So, internet is viewed as in the nature of global commons. The idea being that there should be free flow of information over the internet. There should be no restriction from one country, whether you are speaking from here within your own country or whether you're speaking across to anybody in the world. There should be no restriction at all. And it's also related to free speech, etc. So this is the thinking of liberal democracies, of the governments themselves. Public in any case, I would say public even in autocracies would want the same thing. But really speaking, it is the autocracy. Now, what view does autocracies take? They are not going by this aspect of it. They would like to control the flow of information. So we have this example of the Great Firewall of China, which everybody talks about. So this advantage of viewing it as a global commons and not interfering with the free flow of information, if we go by this philosophy, then you can't set up national firewalls. So we are now, let's compare, for example, since the global shield, the golden shield of China, also the Great Firewall of China, there's aspects of the same thing. So let's look at a nation like China, our own daunting adversary, and ourselves. How are we at a disadvantage? So they've set up their firewalls. So there are two things which come out of it. One is that if they have to launch a cyber attack of any level, let's say a state level cyber attack, we hear of the Bombay electrical grid. China was behind it. Attribution is difficult, but that's what is generally understood. So we don't have any firewalls to check anything at where the ingress takes place into our country. Whereas they have set up their firewalls, their packets are being scanned in and out both ways. So to launch a technical cyber attack on, let us say, the critical infrastructure or any sort of attack we want to launch to disrupt their systems, that becomes that much more difficult. It is not impossible, but it becomes that much more difficult. Now let's look at a non-cyber operation. You mentioned social media. So influence operations, when we talk about, even one has to send messages across, a propaganda message or trolls, etc. There again, if you have such mechanisms in place where every traffic which is moving into and out of a nation, autocratic nation like China, is scrutinized before being released, then even influence operations, they have greater safety. Whereas on the other hand, here there is no scrutiny at all. So it reaches the general public, and fault lines, whatever are there in the societies, can be exploited. So that's the result of the entire thing in both aspects, technical as well as, that means, actual cyber operations where cyber expertise is required for disruption, and influence operations through cyberspace. At both bases, national firewalls, cyber firewalls, which are set up, would give an advantage to the autocratic nations. So that's one facet of it. The second facet is to do with, now we are coming to uh, data privacy. So, now this tension which I'm talking about is what happens between the citizens of a state vis-a-vis the governments of a state. Now, we are not talking of an adversary state like an autocratic nation, but again, the liberal democratic nations are at a disadvantage. How are they at a disadvantage? So, if the government of the day wants to, you know, put some controls in order to check, well-intentioned controls to, for example, to counter terrorist activities within the country. It's an internal security problem. So a terrorist activity in the country, it wants to, let us say you heard about this WhatsApp, that encryption in WhatsApp and all, so access should be there, all this debate was going on. So any such activity where the privacy of individual citizens gets affected, you have this privacy advocacy groups, NGOs, etc., which come into play, and there's huge resistance to putting across, controls which would affect the privacy of an individual. So this is a tension between the state and its citizens, based on which notion of that my data is private and it should not be interfered with, and government should not have access to it. Whereas the government would want to have access not for any other purpose. You heard of this Pegasus also, it's all related. All these issues are related. It may be very well intentioned to counter certain nefarious activities which are taking place within the nation. So this is the second facet of it. The third facet is to do with social media giants, and this has to do with this is a tension because of profit vis-a-vis privacy. Now this is a conflict between social media giants on the one hand and citizens on the other. Not the government is not coming into play. So, for example, your own data, you go into Amazon and do all sorts of things, and Facebooks and various things, and all your profiling is being done and marketing is being targeted at you, but your own privacy is at stake because your entire profile is available with this social media giants, or not only social media giants. I'm also talking of commercial organizations, business, etc., like Amazon, etc. So they have control of this data, and many of them misutilize it. All these hearings and all these great people, Facebook boss, etc. Not only India, US, everywhere they've been called. Australia. I mean, laws are coming out to put control over these commercials. So this is a tension between commercial profit and the same privacy aspect of citizens, right? And there are aspects like data localization which are related to this. So this is the third angle. There is also a fourth angle, and this fourth angle is related to specifically China per se, and this is being referred to as digital colonialism. What does that mean? Digital colonialism. What does that mean? We've heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's in the physical spaces. How China wants to influence its nations around the world by going in for the Belt and Road Initiative. One facet of the Belt and Road Initiative is also the digital Silk Road. Digital Silk Road. That's right, DSR. Now, there are many angles to it. I'll not go into detail because the time is a little limited. But what I'm saying is that this digital colonialism involves that you build a fiber optic information infrastructure, not just fiber optics, information infrastructure as part of this Belt and Road Initiative. So you lay down fiber optic cables, you set up servers. So you have complete control over the information infrastructure. The moment you have control of the information infrastructure, then you also have commercial platforms like, for example, Paytm. You set up these. So through these, you're having a control over the financial dealings of these states which are using all this. Even we are affected in some manner. When we say that, okay, there's some partial ownership of whatever Paytm, but there are many other platforms. All these apps, another 54 apps, I think, how many number of apps were again, banned just recently, a couple of days back. So all this is part of digital colonialism. Why is it colonialism? That you're going into these areas, you're setting up infrastructure, and ultimately you are having control over what, in a sense, their sovereignty. Because in manners in which they function, now you have your power to influence the way those governments function. You can take the example of how China and Pakistan, etc., CPEC, etc. So all that aspect is there, and there is also the aspect of ideology. So if you have such sort of a control, and if you are an authoritarian state, after all, digital colonialism could be done by a liberal democracy also. But if you are an authoritative state, you would also want to firstly have control over standards in the cyber domain, and also propagate your ideology, authoritarianism ideology, through these means. So everything is related. So all of this comes under the facet of digital colonialism. And there's a side aspect also there. And that side aspect is data is the new oil. Now, data is the new oil is really in relation to the artificial intelligence aspects which are coming. So this is true for the social media giants also. And this is true for initiatives like the DSR2, where if you set up the infrastructure, you have control over data. Similarly, social media giants and other commercial giants, they have control over your data. And that data is very important to make breakthroughs or become world leaders in AI applications. So I've told you several things. I've told you how global commons, national firewalls, how it affects cyber operation and influence operations. I've talked about the citizen vis-a-vis state, these things, again to do with liberal democracies and autocracies, social media giants, that of course is applicable at all places, digital colonialism. So there are so many angles to this aspect of why autocracies have what an upper hand over liberal democracies as far as cyberspace aspects are concerned.
It's quite interesting that you bring this out in the way that you've done it, because we see examples of this happening around us every day. There are minor levels of, I won't call them attacks, but minor levels of influence operations that are taking place in by China in friendly as well as adversary countries to mold the perception of people towards its own goals. And one of the biggest things that we see about the Beijing 2022 is that there's been a constant effort to portray a very right image of China within the social media or the free and open social media of the world. It's a very, very interesting thing, sir. So coming
If
to
I may add to this, just one point I would like to add, that as far as these influence operations through cyberspace are concerned, the state which has shown the maximum expertise and has had the maximum effects is Russia. It is very well known. It started with Estonia in 2007, and thereafter Georgia in 2008, and then Ukraine, then 2015, etc. And you're right, Crimea, and now recently also 15th of Jan there was an attack, and now what happens in the next few days? Let's see. So all this is Russia has really honed this expertise to a very high level.
So talking about Russia, as you rightly mentioned, that there were attacks that were conducted by Russian-backed cyber activists or cyber, whatever you may want to call them. I don't know, the cyber force, if I may put it that way, because there's not a particular term that can be applied to these guys who are acting on behalf of a state to another one. We see that cyber attacks have, and this is something that a lot of strategists are talking about, that cyber attacks would predate an actual invasion of a country to kind of cripple the infrastructure systems within the country. The Chinese also fight in a similar manner, which is called the informatized warfare. They want to actually hit the systems to cripple a response. As a country in India today facing a threat from another authoritarian regime, which is world famous for its firewall and stuff like that, how well are we prepared to defend ourselves against such actions?
Yeah. So that's the real meat of all this discussion is ultimately something needs to be done. We have to make ourselves capable, and it's not to be taken lightly. National security is at stake. So how well prepared are we? That's a great question, and I'll try to give my view on that. See, when we want to try and assess the preparedness, there are three different areas, broad areas one needs to look at. One is, do we have a strategy in place? Everything starts with strategy. So do we have a strategy in place? A strategy which caters for offensive defense as one of its pillars. You know, so we will look at that. The second aspect is, are our structures, how our cyber effort in the nation, after all, anything to do with cyberspace, security, including offensive defense and offense, everything, it's all a whole of nation effort, right from all government agencies, right to the entire society. Everybody is involved in defense of national cyberspace in some form or the other.
True.
The question is, do we have the right governance architecture and the right organizations to be able to handle the different facets which we've talked about? And the third is the aspect of skill development, because just having structures is not good enough if you don't have the skilled manpower to do it. Because cyber, unlike, for example, making tanks and aircraft, etc., cyber is really dependent on human skills primarily. There's a lot of there's some sophisticated hardware and all involved, but primarily it has to do with skill availability and expertise development, human skills. So these are the three areas one need to look at. So let's look at the first, strategy. I would not spend too much time on it. What I can tell you is that if you look at, of course, strategies as far as China and Russia and all are not so readily available. But if you look at the US, you look at the UK, you look at Australia and some other nations, you'll find that they have come out with very clear cyberspace. I won't really give a common name to it, but cyberspace strategies which clearly spell out that they have offensive elements, organizations and offensive elements, and they are willing to take offensive cyber actions and even other actions, non-cyber actions, if they are under attack. So this has been clearly spelled out in the national strategies. We in India, so far, of course, whatever strategy we have something of 2012, I think the cyber strategies of 2012, but that is a little passive. We are now expecting the new one, which the Prime Minister himself announced on the Red Fort last August, that it is impending, it is going to come out. But I do not think that we would have, let's hope that it is there, but I am not expecting the offensive defense aspect of cyber defense to be part of it. So unless it is there as declared, because it is also required from the point of view of, as part of that, deterrence by retaliation, because there is no deterrence unless adversaries know that you have this capability and intend to use it. So for example, let's compare it with nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence, firstly, you got to have the capability, demonstrated capability. That is one part. And secondly, you got to have a policy. Under what conditions are you going to use it? So in our case, there's no first use. Of course, we are one of the few who are in the no fuse use. China also says, but it's got a lot of conditionality. We don't have that conditionality. Ours is a much simpler and straightforward no first use nuclear policy. So I'm just saying that deterrence works only firstly, it is a demonstrated capability, and secondly, it is part of your strategy. It is known that you will take action. So that is the first thing where we differ, or let us say we are not as much there as, for example, the US, UK, and three examples I've given you, where clearly it is laid down in the strategy. Now let's look at organizations. So let's start with the United States. It came out with now we are roughly talking about the offensive cyber capability. So it came out with the Cyber Command way back in 2010 itself. It reached the 6,200 people were, that was the organization. The strength was 6,200. It took them 8 years to build up the 6,200 personnel. That's the time of takes for developing skills, the right skills. It's not that you just fill up people saying that they are cyber qualified. You have to have the right skills. So it took them 8 years to fill up just 6,200 cyber personnel. So they have the Cyber Command. Then they have the NSA, which is a much older organization, National Security Agency. That's also part of the Department of Defense, incidentally. The NSA is part of the Department of Defense. So both the Cybercom and the National Security Agency is part of the Department of Defense. In addition, you have also, as part of the Department of Homeland Security, there's an organization which was raised about 3 years back, 2019 or 18, something, very recently, 3-4 years back. It's called the CISA. It's the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency. Now, that is the organization with the Department of Homeland Security, the equivalent of our Ministry of Home Affairs, which is tasked to protect the critical infrastructure and anything to do with that. However, it is not really endowed with offensive cyber capabilities. So if you are talking offensive cyber capabilities, there are two organizations one can talk about, the National Security Agency and the Cyber Command. Now let's look at UK. The UK National Security Agency is an intelligence agency. Cyber Command is a military agency, but both are the Department of Defense. UK has its government communication headquarters. That's a very, very old, right from Second World War onwards, it has evolved. So the GCHQ, Government Communication Headquarters, GCHQ, that's primarily the National Intelligence Agency. Today it has got roots in the defense forces. However, today it reports to the equivalent of an External Affairs Ministry, the Foreign Secretary. That's what it reports to. So the GCHQ had offensive cyber capabilities. It still has, I suppose, continues. But they felt the need to raise a national cyber force. So the National Cyber Force came up in April 2020, 20 or 21. I think it was 20, April 2020. I might be mixing up, either 20 or 21. I think it's 20. Now, this National Cyber Force is a joint effort between the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Ministry, or the intelligence. That means the GCHQ and the Defense Forces, UK Defense Forces. It's a joint effort. But it is learned, it's still very new. It is learned that most of the staffing would be done by the defense personnel. That is the flavor of the NCF. And its primary charter is offensive cyber operations. And offensive cyber operations, not just in conjunction with military operations, offensive cyber operations of all types, which means against crime also, against terrorism, all types of offensive cyber operations, non-state actors, all types of offensive cyber operations, whatever offensive capabilities, that will be handled by the National Cyber Force. It also has a 6th division that is part of the Defense Forces. This is a joint one, but 6th division is part of the Defense Forces, which is not just cyber, it is also information operations per se. So you look at electronic warfare and psychological operations. All that is also part of the 6th Division, part of the defense forces. So this is the type of capability which UK has developed, along with, like I said, a properly, clearly enunciated strategy. Then let's look at Australia. Australia has got the Australian Signals Directorate. Now, again, the Australian Signals Directorate is an national intelligence agency, but it has got roots in the defense and also reports to it's under the Ministry of Defense. They also have, as part of the Australian Signals Directorate, and it is offensive cyber capabilities there as part of it. In addition to the offensive cyber capability as part of the ASD, and it's all in the open domain. I'm not talking of any information which is classified. It's all in the open domain. They also have something called a Defense SIGINT and Cyber Command. Now, this is a very unique sort of a thing. The Defense SIGINT and Cyber Command is made up of Australian Defence Forces, all personnel of Defence Forces, but working within the ASD. So they have a system where you have your Defence Forces people working within a civilian-headed Australian Signals Directorate. So they were earlier scattered in this ASD. Now they've been put together as the Defense SIGINT. SIGINT is Signal Intelligence and Cyber Command. So this is the office. And then in addition, they also have an information warfare, which is properly part of the Defense Forces. So this is the offensive capability as far as Australia is concerned. Now let's look at China. So we know that China came up with the Strategic Support Force on 31st December 2015. And Strategic Support Force, the agenda is similar: electronic warfare, cyber warfare, psychological operations, and also space. The fourth element is space. So this potent strategic support force, which has BLA Strategic Support Force, is what China came up with 5 years back, and gradually it is developing its capabilities. So it will take care of, we talked of two types of things: the influence operations and the cyber attacks, as well as the cyber influence operations is both part of the Charter of Reserve, in addition to, like I said, space and electronic warfare. Then it has got the Ministry for State Security, MSS. That you can say is the equivalent of, you can say, the NSA, CIA combined. So that is a civilian agency, but it also carries out, as far as most of the influence operation that we were referring to in connection with China would probably come out of the MSS. They also have a Ministry of Public Security, MPS. That is internal looking, but MSS is external looking. So these are the types of organizations which are there, and all of them have got their strategies in place. Now coming to India. So in India, we have the CERT-In. Now the CERT-In is part of the METI, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. It is an advisory body. It looks at cyber incidents, issues advisories to see what all is happening, where the worms, etc. It takes a good account of that. It's got good expertise for that part of it. And it issues advisories to all users, individual users, private sector, governments, etc., that you take your necessary action, but it has got no offensive cyber capability within it. At least it's not in the charter. Then you have the NCIIPC, the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, NCIIPC. That's actually organized under RAW, but really functions under the PMO. So maybe a certain amount of offensive cyber capabilities there. I will not delve too much upon that, but that is an agency. It's an intelligence agency, ultimately. Its roots, everything is an intelligence agency. But this intelligence agency is not anything to do with defense intelligence. It is a purely civilian, external-looking intelligence agency which functions essentially for the requirements of the Ministry of External Affairs. That means outward-facing, external-facing intelligence agency. You have raised the Defense Cyber Agency in 2019, which is the defense force which is there, and it is just coming up. And you have, of course, the raw certain amount of elements other than NCIPC, which are part of raw. You have a certain capability being developed by the DRDO. So these are the various, things which we have. The essential point which I am trying to bring out here. Firstly, we have to look at the numbers. We have to look at the types of people who are there, and what role does the defense forces have in this entire protection of national cyberspace. Now, if you look at the organizations of the other 4 or 5 which I referred to, US, UK, Australia, China, I don't have too much information on Russia. Of course, I have information. I didn't go into it. You have the GRU. Earlier it was civilian people carrying out these information operations which I talked about in Estonia, Georgia and all. Gradually it shifted from their FSB to the GRU. GRU is a military intelligence agency. So now GRU is supposed to be at the pivot of their influence information operations per se. They don't use the word cyber, they use the word information operation. So I'm saying that the defense forces are pivotal in each of these cases. In the case, and I'll also link it up with, I talked of multi-domain operations. So when we talk of full-fledged conflicts, we are talking of multi-domain operations in all 5 domains of land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. So in my view, that is my own personal view, that the defense forces in India need to become pivotal as far as offensive cyber operations are concerned. I'm saying that it is an all-of-nation effort. Everybody is involved, but defense forces have to be pivotal. And so we have to move in this direction. So that is the sum of what I wanted to say as to how well prepared we are. And yes, once we have these structures, proper structures in place and the strategy in place, skill development will follow then. So we have a lot of skills as far as the defensive part is concerned. There's no doubt about it. In fact, we improved our position on the cyber security. There was a report recently, somewhere around around 50, 60 to the 10th position now. So we've improved our position drastically in the last few years, but that's more on the pure defensive part. We need to do much more as far as the offensive capability is concerned, is my own personal view.
I absolutely agree, sir. As a matter of fact, post the Mumbai incident, there has not been a major attack of any sort which has been reported, at least. So I guess there is some work which is happening, which is in the shadows, and fair enough. If it's protecting our VAVPs, then that's what is required. So my final question to you is: the Prime Minister recently, announced the formation of a national cyber force. You also mentioned offensive capabilities. You also have brought out various different factors in what the other countries are doing. By what is available in the public domain, what is this all about, and do we need to do more about in this particular aspect?
Yeah. So I briefly touched upon what our approach. I mean, where are we at the moment in compared with others, and what we need to do about it. So, what further we need to do about it? So, again, I mean, this is an area which is, a tricky area in the sense that it is not easily solved. After all, these countries which have done it, and I mean, I've just referred to 4, but there's a huge amount of effort going on in various other countries also. And it's not easy to come up with the right model. So every country has to come up with its own model. Now, if you compare the US model to, for example, the UK model, there's a big difference. The US model, offensive cyber capability is purely within the defense forces. The NSA is also under the Department of Defense, but really speaking, the main offensive cyber capability is with the Cyber Command, which is defense forces. Whereas in the UK, I said that the model which has been adopted, the latest model, which is just about a year old, is a joint effort between intelligence agency like GCHQ and the defense forces of the UK. So it's a joint thing, and it's still not clear even to them as to how it is going to, because it's a very new thing. So they're still evolving. I mean, which is the ministry? So there are two ministries involved. The foreign minister, are equivalent of our external affairs ministry. I don't know what they must be calling it, Minister of State or something like department, the State Department of the US. Foreign minister is one ministry and the defense ministry. So how a single agency will be dual controlled because the tasking is across the board. They've got one agency which will look at cyber crimes later, it will look at full-fledged conflict. The entire spectrum is to be handled by the National Cyber Force, of course, supported, in addition, complemented by, like I said, the 6th UK division is there, which is an internal defense forces division. So there's a difference in the model. Similarly, I painted the Australian model to you. There again, the intelligence is involved, the defense forces are involved, both under the Ministry of Defense. But so you have the main actors as far as offensive cyber is concerned, which are involved, really speaking, are from the point of view of intelligence is one set of actors, the defense forces is the second set of actors, and there's a third set of actors which is to do with internal security, so critical infrastructure. Because when we are looking at offensive cyber and full-fledged conflict, it is the critical infrastructure, especially in gray zone warfare, etc., and it's built up to a full-fledged conflict. The critical infrastructure is the one which is going to be the victim of the attacks, which will affect national security. I mean, from a national security perspective. So the Ministry of Home Affairs also needs to be involved in this entire. After all, the armed forces cannot start looking at, and critical infrastructure involves a huge amount of private sector too. But if there's an attack, so I have told you, as far as offensive cyber is concerned, there are three types of people who can have offensive cyber capability, and the right mix has to be found amongst them. Right? So if an organized crime is there, whether MHA should, and we have a defend forward or hunt forward strategy against organized crime, well, the MHA could act against that, have that hunt forward capability within MHA, or we could have the armed forces doing it, you could have the intelligence in it. So that model has to be worked out, right? As far as the private sector is concerned, they cannot be given. I mean, the general consensus around the world, although some discussion is there, but private sector is not likely to be given offensive cyber capability for various reasons. I mean, this is a general consensus around the world. Although some discussion in the US is going on whether private sector should get involved in the hack back. It's called hacking back. So if they are hacked, should they be given the authorities to hack back? This is how it is being referred to, but that's not likely to be agreed. The armed forces, in my opinion, need to have a pivotal role in offensive cyber operations in line with the same charter which they have in the other domains of land, sea, air. Space is again an area where things are a little nebulous because the space domain, etc., that warrants actually a separate discussion. So I'll not go into that. So armed forces need to be pivotal. That's my opinion. And intelligence agencies, definitely they are involved. But in line with their main charter, deal with strategic intelligence per se and support the war fighting mechanism with their intelligence. So it should be in line with the standard charters. MHA, Home Affairs, should be involved in countering cybercrime. I would say that, I mean, this is just broad thinking because it requires a huge amount of deliberation. That really speaking, it's better not to fritter or let's say distribute offensive cyber capability all over. So I would say they should do everything to counter cybercrime in terms of security measures, etc., and work in conjunction with agencies which have got offensive cyber capability. Then you have the Ministry of Electronics and IT. I mean, this is another major ministry. I'm talking of ministries now. So it comes into play. Why does it come into play? Because the entire infrastructure is handled and applications is handled by the Ministry of METI itself. And Ministry of Communications also, Department of Telecommunications also comes into play because they are the ones who are controlling the entire information infrastructure per se. METI looks after applications and the e-governance part of it. They were bifurcated only in 2016. So both these ministries are involved, but I would say their charter would be restricted to the defensive part. Private sector, I've already covered. That again, one is protecting themselves because they are part of critical infrastructure. Of course, their own non-critical infrastructure also, but critical infrastructure, for example, if there are distribution networks and power networks and or financial banks, etc. Well, national security is involved, but private sector should be guarding it. But they should be aided in great manner by a central agency. So that model. But they've got two very important roles. One is to develop robust infrastructure. So, for example, if you have routers being developed within the country, then robust routing routers which cannot be attacked. So, development of that information infrastructure is the domain of the private sector. And similarly, skill development. So, if armed forces are given the charter for offensive cyber warfare, well, the skill development for that has to be done by the private sector. I mean, government as well as private education, it comes from their academia. So that is another major role of the private sector, skill development. As far as academia and R&D is concerned, again, skill development, all academia, skill development, and cyber tools, R&D organizations, wherever it can be, distributed to private defense as well as even private R&D could possibly be brought in for building cyber tools, etc. And you have this aspect of cyber influence operations. So while offensive cyber operations, I'm saying armed forces need to play a pivotal role in offensive cyber operations, at least that those which affect national security. The cyber influence operation is a very tricky affair. It's a new thing. People are still grappling with it. How to handle, where you are through messages, you are trying to, exploit the fault lines in societies. So who should carry out this task? Probably it would be a mix between armed forces and intelligence agencies. But anyway, this is a very gray area, very difficult to say. So in summary, what I'm trying to say is that we should take cues from what others are doing, and we should make up a strategy and come up with a model which best suits us. And like I said, I'll repeat once again, in my view, the armed forces, from various first principles reasons which you think about it, they need to play a pivotal role as far as cyberspace is concerned, offensive cyber operations is concerned, defense of national cyberspace is concerned. I'll stop there.
No, I think what you brought about is very interesting, sir, because there has to be a division of effort which is done by one governmental, two non-governmental, which are private entities that you mentioned, and of course I'm going to put the armed forces as as a third segment altogether, which can be termed as government, but as a third segment altogether, which could carry out various different kinds of operations. Influence operations, outside India is something that Indians always feel that we have a shortcoming in, and it's not something that we see, uh, being pushed across in a very aggressive way in various different aspects. And today, one thing that we realize, there's an unorganized effort which is being put across by a certain number of individuals on their own probable capability to create some sort of an influence operations within our adversaries. But otherwise, it's not a very holistic approach. That's what you're also putting across. So this has been an interesting discussion, because one of the biggest things that we realize today, the realm of war and the spectrum of war is actually expanding day by day. And with the entire operations which is being conducted by the Russians on Ukraine, one can realize that cyber offensive and cyber attacks are going to be the name of the game for the future. At the end of it, everything is connected. I mean, you have your phones and this and that. Everybody is connected around the place, and it is a huge uh, deterrence, and it as well as an offensive capability for an adversary or a receiving country for that matter. Thanks so much, sir. I think great research. Of course, this is something that will come to you pretty naturally, but for us to understand the whole spectrum is very interesting, and I hope we are able to actually develop on this particular capability so that we can protect this nation of ours. As I said, thank you so much. Till next time, sir. Another subject, another day. Jai Hind, sir.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Thank you so much.